There are stats that would say something like 75–80% of businesses are never sold. The only downside about that is if anyone came along to buy your business, they're only going to make you a small upfront offer with a large earn-out form of deferred consideration because you are the business and you're going to have to win yourself.
When you do good things and so you have nice things in life, and I think it's important sometimes to be grounded and understand that kind of sense of purpose that you have. When those things go and you're left with the money in the bank, and then who you are.
And it's not necessarily who's bid the most money, it's who's offering the best structure, who's offering the most certainty, which buyer has been through the purchase before, because that's always a good indication. If a buyer's bought a business before, you know that they know what the process is.
So welcome back to another episode of Build with Dean. Today I'm thrilled to introduce someone who brings a wealth of experience in the legal and commercial world. So David Little. David's a partner with Bishop and Sewell, where he's a cornerstone of their corporate and commercial team. And he's a seasoned business lawyer specializing in everything from acquisitions and disposals to corporate finance, including small cap listings. But David's not just about the boardroom, he's also a passionate sports enthusiast and has built a notable sports law practice focused on governance, marketing, and finance in the sports world. So his clients love his common sense approach and also real world insight. And I know that you're going to get a ton of value from our chat today with David. So let's dive in. So David, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Dean. Thank you very much for the kind intro. I almost didn't recognize myself there.
Bless you. I'm sure actually it's probably amplified. So interesting subject that I think is going to be important for a lot of businesses of whatever size. So let's start with kind of why founders and businesses find this such a complex area.
Right, I think there's a whole host of reasons, really, and I think there are stats which are out there which say something like 75–80% of businesses are never sold. I think from a business owner perspective, it's that loss of control. They lose their sense of purpose. They don't really have an idea on what they want to do next. And they don't know really, they know how to run a business. They don't know how to go about selling a business. And we've all heard these horror stories out there about business brokers. And I have to add, there are some really good ones that I know. But what tales I've heard where a seller would pay maybe £10,000 or £15,000 up front for nothing more than, say, a tip sheet, and the broker does very little then to find a buyer. And if a buyer is found, the broker then wants to charge a fairly hefty percentage slice. And sometimes even the seller stopped using that business broker. I've gone off on a tangent here, but it's one of the hot topics. Even when the seller doesn't use that business broker, they may still be locked in for a period of time. So if they sell their business through their own efforts, they've still got to pay commission to the business broker. It's a bit like we can all remember dodgy recruitment agents over time who just want their fees.
Interesting.
So I think it's the fear of the unknown from the business owner's point of view, and concern that they would have to spend a lot of money selling their business, which isn't necessarily true, and they'd have to engage pompous individuals such as accountants and yours truly, which again I'd like to say I'd hope I'd come across more pragmatic and reasonable on costs, with that transparency on fees.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that when people, are in business or they've set up, they're not always focused on exit. And although some are right from the start, right?
Yeah, some are right from the start. Yeah, I've put together shareholders agreements for a startup, and they want to talk about an exit policy in 5 years' time. And I've said, you haven't told me what the business does yet. I don't think you've sold a single widget yet, but you do. You're right. There are those who go into business. Some run it as a lifestyle choice. They'll use the business money as their own money, etc., which you can do when you've got a clever accountant. But they're not going in with a view to, say, selling in 20 years' time.
Yeah, true. And so assuming then the ones that, are selling is on the agenda? Because I think, I mean, there's loads of types of businesses, isn't there? So the way I see the business world is kind of, you have your freelance businesses, the very small
Yeah, sure.
ones that kind of owners
More and
in the
more of them.
business,
Yeah,
yeah,
more
do
and
it.
more. Where the owner is the business. Yeah, that's often the
Yeah,
issue in terms
exactly.
of trying to sell.
And then I think there's that chasm of death, isn't there, where the owner doesn't want to be in the business. They want to be kind of doing other stuff, probably higher level stuff that can grow the business, but they don't want to be doing. So then they need the team, and that kind of cavity of death. When you start to grow a team, all those problems that come. And then when you go past that, if they've got a really nice lifestyle business, and I think it's nice now, you can have kind of 1 to 10 employees, maybe
Mm.
1 to 10 million quid,
Mm.
and you can have a really, maybe there's no investors. It's lovely.
Well, you
But
just raised a really valid point there. You touched upon it.
hmm,
One of the difficulties business owners have is that they uh, are not are not dispensable. So you have to. It's really difficult. If you ask a business owner how indispensable they are to the business, many of them will go, "Well, without me, there is no business. Without me, the business doesn't run." And you have to then carefully prick that ego a bit there gently. Well, the only downside about that is if anyone came along to buy your business, they're only going to make you a small upfront offer with a large earn-out form of deferred consideration because you are the business and you're going to have to wean yourself away. So go away,
yeah,
think that through, come back in 3 months and we'll have a second stab. And another thing from a business owner point of view, you raise staff. Um, if the business owner does want to make themselves slightly more dispensable, they find it very difficult to bring in a trusted number two because they're giving
mm,
element of control of the business. But that's the key, that's often the key recruit. And I often encourage business owners that they should consider putting in place an EMI or similar share option scheme to incentivize the employees. And you have to explain this to the business owner. You're not giving away equity. Well, at least you're not until there's a sale, as in an exit event.
yeah,
What you're doing is you are incentivizing key employees to stay with the business, to build the business, to increase the value, to get you to an exit. But there are still some business owners out there who don't want to share their equity, even if having that number two has got their value of the business from 1 million to 2 million, with
yeah.
with maybe the really useful recruit pocketing a small sum of that. But that they're the sort of key decisions. I mean, business owners, if they're going
Mm,
to be successful, have to give away not so much that, not so much give away an element of control because they are the majority owner, but
mm.
have to bring on someone who they can trust and who can then help run the business and let the owner become more strategic. That was the word you used earlier as well.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I think, and then, they can then have that stage that they get to. And then I think there's, of course, the other side when you go from the kind of, oh, well, now we want to be a big business. That's an
There
even
are
bigger cavity of
well
death, isn't it?
so many, but so many get to a certain level, and it doesn't have to be a
Yeah,
corporate. It can be a law firm, for example. We would probably fit within that box,
yeah.
where you grow the business to a certain size, and then it's how do we go to the next level?
Mm.
And so many businesses, and you look at it, how do we go to the next level? Can we grow it organically? If so, how? Or do we grow by way of acquisition? That's obviously got its risks as well. Well, I mean,
And we'll come on to mergers
good.
and acquisitions in this conversation
I
a little
wasn't
bit
trying to rush
later.
it forward here.
But so assuming then, so like we know the types of businesses that the audience are going to have and the challenges that they're going to have, and I think we probably described most of the
Yeah.
businesses they're going to fit into those boxes. So when it comes to looking at selling, then assuming that we're preparing to look at selling, so kind of what are the most overlooked things that businesses have, and that could be contractual or not.
Often not planning ahead. A business owner will just assume, well, I've made a decision, I'm going to sell my business, I'll appoint a business broker or I'll go and see my accountant and I expect it to be sold in 6 months. It doesn't work that way. And
Mm,
also, if you did have an offer immediately, um, you've had no time to consider whether that's the best offer you're going to get, whether it's the right structure in terms of the offer, And I think a lot of advisors, business brokers would say that ideally you should start planning 3 or 4 years out before you sell. And by that I mean, if you're a
Mm,
business which relies on 2 or 3 key business customer clients, you need to make sure you've got really good watertight contracts with those people. The same way with your staff as well. And that's why spending a bit of time or money 3 or 4 years out actually, one, saves money and considerable pain with the due diligence, another area we can talk about in
yeah.
the future. You may also, by structuring the business in a certain way and putting the right contracts in place, you might increase the value. The other common mistake that business owners make,
What
they
about
think, sorry.
yeah, no, I mean, well, tell me more about that. So any classic mistakes that they make?
Well, a classic mistake would be when they find a buyer or they receive an offer, they think it's job done. And there are lots of business advisors out there who will say that one buyer isn't a buyer at all, because that buyer's got total control then in terms of the purchase process. Because if that buyer then decides to drop the price or change the structure, there's no other buyers out there. So I think the expression that a business broker would use, they want to create competitive tension. So a good business broker will go out to maybe 10, 12, 15 on a discrete basis, and will ideally be able to attract 3 offers and then spend time going through that with the business owner. And it's not necessarily who's bid the most money, it's who's offering the best structure, who's offering the most certainty, which buyer has been through the purchase before, because that's always a good indication. If a buyer's bought a business before, you know that they know what the process is.
Yeah.
So that's typically one of the main mistakes a buyer would make there. And this frequently happens. They'll agree the heads of terms. Someone like me gets brought in quite late. The buyer then does the due diligence, sees something it doesn't like, may decide to pull out of the transaction, and the seller's left high and dry. The seller has already mentally started spending the money, has switched off from the business.
And
So the
that's the
seller's got to
dangerous
go.
part, isn't it?
Absolutely, but that happens all the time. You have
Does
to
it?
coach.
Wow.
Yeah, you have to coach your seller that, one, try and get 3 bids on the table or more, and secondly, make sure there is someone to run the business, because it's not sold until the moment of completion. And sorry, Dean, I just remember one other thing as well. The other main mistake, and it's really important that a seller deals with this, or their advisors deals with this more or less immediately, heads of terms are agreed. You must find out that the buyer has got proof of funds. It's so important. If the buyer says, "Oh, don't worry, I'm borrowing the money," don't progress. Wait until he's got a definitive offer, because the bank or the lender, they'll also want to carry out extensive due diligence as well to make sure the business is worth what it says on the tin.
And these are the kind of invaluable nuggets, because there's going to be people out there just about to probably make a mistake. And so what I want from this conversation is that we kind of get some things out that are food for thought, so that people can actually. So let's talk about the due diligence then. So what is that? What does one?
Yeah, of
What does
course.
it involve?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't anyone out there thinking of selling their business, it can go smoothly. I'm not trying to frighten you away. And I always do think that someone who's run a business for 10, 20 years, it's lovely to see them have the benefit of all their efforts. So let me just make that caveat. Right, due diligence, normally split into two, would normally follow the heads of terms. So you'd have the heads of terms, which would say these heads of terms are not legally binding, save for certain clauses, perhaps an exclusivity period, and perhaps a confidentiality provision. The confidentiality provision being absolutely vital, because if it's one of your competitors who's about to do due diligence, you don't want them seeing all your customer lists. You don't want that unless they're signed up on a really tight confidentiality agreement. Otherwise, they're using it as a phishing exercise. So once you've established that, heads of terms signed, the buyer then will send in his finance team to look at the numbers. That'll be not just the statutory accounts, which are publicly available anyway. That'll be management accounts, all sorts, trying to establish what the net profits of the business are, trying to establish what the EBIT are. That's another term, I guess, for net profit. That's earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. I haven't got that bit right.
Yeah.
But that's the vital bit, because basically what the finance DD is trying to establish, he says, moving swiftly on, is that the business is worth what the seller wants. Once the finance DD is taken place, then we're on to the legal due diligence. And this is why I was saying earlier, it's really important to have a dry run 2 or 3 years out, making sure you've got all the contracts in place. This is generally the point where the seller starts tearing their hair out. So if we're acting for a seller, we set up something called an online data room. In the old days, they used to have these physical, when I was starting out as a boy, used to have these physical data rooms where you would go in there and literally look at the contracts there, the physical contracts. Now it's all online. It's all security protected. We run it as the lawyers for the seller, and we grant access to those people who need access. And that's where you get these hideously long 20, 30-page due diligence questionnaires, which have come from a precedent bank. Most of it is not applicable, but that's still the seller's still got to go through that with the advisor and then populate the data room. That's the real time-consuming bit. And if you get through that and all's well, great. We're then on to the legal process then, sale and purchase agreement.
So there's a stat I read earlier in Harvard Business Review. So it says that 79 to 90% of sales and or acquisitions fail because of overlooked risks in the due diligence process.
Yeah, I could believe that. I could believe that. I mean, that ties in with the stat earlier, but in terms of businesses which don't get sold. So yeah, that I mean, if you've got the right advisors in place, for example, when we're instructed to act on the sale, I would say generally 50 to 75% will proceed to completion and the seller will get their funds. There are, at the moment, with the economy, there are complications and delays, but we've got a client on an acquisition trail and they're having trouble with funding. They've had indications of interest on funding, but getting that over the line because the lender wants to carry out due diligence as well. So that.
Well, I was going to say, and of course, there's due diligence on both sides here, isn't there?
Yes, yeah, there is, and that does also add a layer of complexity and a layer of risk, which is why you've come across the Harvard statistic.
Yeah, absolutely. So when who do they need to bring in? So who's involved in the process?
If
accountants, lawyers?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Let me start with business brokers who on bigger deals would be more like a corporate finance advisor, would be there to guide the seller through the documents, not just those where the lawyer's given input or the accountant. But on a small deal, typically it would be the lawyer and the accountant. And if I was acting for the seller, my role would be to make sure the heads of terms are drafted correctly, even though they're non-binding, they have certain moral obligations. To help out very much by setting up the data room and helping out with the due diligence process. Then the buyer solicitors would prepare the sale and purchase agreement. We would review that. That's quite a lengthy process, particularly the warranty section. And then we prepare the all-important, from a seller point of view, disclosure letter. And that is where the seller has the opportunity of getting rid of any potential liability they may have for giving the warranties. So if there's a warranty which says there are no disputes with my employees, if that isn't the case, then you simply make a written disclosure in a disclosure letter prepared and advised upon by the seller's lawyer. And that then would remove the potential future liability. If it's something massive, like a huge tax risk, that's more frequent these days, then one of two things would typically happen. The buyer would either pull out, or the buyer would seek to renegotiate the terms, and then the seller has a decision to make.
Interesting. And is there one or certain things that sellers think don't matter, uh, but are maybe evidently wrong? Is there something common that they overlook?
I don't think there is anything which particularly stands out. Some sellers don't anticipate the length of time it takes, even once the heads of terms are agreed.
Yeah.
I think I touched upon this before. Some sellers fail to check that the buyer has the cash, either directly or via funders. That's another thing. There's no
Is
real
that the
panic.
excitement? When you get all that
Well, you
giddy
do get some.
excitement of the
Well, you
sale.
do. Yeah, you do get. Yeah, you see that frequently where you see both sides of the coin. Actually, you see some potential sellers mentally spending their money. They're already at what is it, Sandy Lane, the hotel in Barbados. There are
Yeah.
others who haven't got a clue what they're going to do next. There was a chap I've got to know. He sold his business,
Interesting.
and I think he pocketed maybe £8 or £10 million, so he'd done very well out of it. But the next day, he takes a phone call from his wife, and his wife said, "Where are you?" And he said, "I'm in the car." And she said, Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to the office." She said, "Well, you sold your business yesterday." And he was bereft, didn't know what to do. He had to go traveling for 6 months to find himself. And then he's now an advisor to entrepreneurs in terms of one, helping them scale up, and also generally saying, "What's your sense of purpose? What do you plan to do when you've sold the business?" And some sellers are completely bereft.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, if someone tucked 5 million or £10 million into my business, I'd be in the Caribbean watching the cricket, or Australia watching the British Lions when they played, or traveling all around Europe watching any sort of big football games. I'd have no I'd have no trouble. I'd,
I
I'd have
think that's, I mean, it's an important thing though, because I do think
absolutely
a
vital.
lot of
The people,
people, they don't understand what truly, and of course it's not, I firmly believe that it's not your personality. When you do good things, and so you have nice things in life, like you have these kind of labels and you have material things, and I think it's important sometimes to be grounded and understand that kind of sense of purpose that you have, because and that's what the problem then is, that when those things go and you're left with the money in the bank and then who you are, then I think that can be a real problem for people, can't it?
yeah,
Because they're just used to the subconscious
yeah,
patterns that they do.
absolutely, absolutely, and also they're used to be being listened to. They're used to having a presence. They're used to having a purpose, and
Mm.
that does go
Do you
on that.
think, probably going off on a tangent, but obviously you
Mm.
do a lot within sports as well, and
Oh
I
yeah,
I,
yeah.
I follow sports a lot, and that I find that quite common ground, that when people retire, and it's like, there's this whole identity of
Oh, that is
gap.
such that is such a big topic. Without
Mm.
going into it in depth, we've just had a suicide recently, haven't we? By Ricky Hatton, absolutely tragic. Someone who
Yeah, yeah.
didn't have someone to coach him and help him have a sense of purpose post retirement. He found being retired incredibly difficult. I think there was Gail Ems, the female badminton player, Olympic, may have got a silver medal. When she retired, she had very little, didn't know what to do. Lots of
Mm.
cricketers. Is some are really switched on. They may be doing that. There's a footballer, a Welsh footballer at Tottenham Hotspur, Ben Davis. He's been there for 12 years. He's already done a degree. He's already set up for the next. He'll go on and be successful in business. There's no
Yeah.
doubt about that, because he's switched on as well. And there'll be rugby players as well as some cricketers. But there's an awful lot to go by the wayside who don't know what they're going to do once they turn 35. And it's not necessarily financially based either. Yes, it is for some, where they realise their earning income's gone, but it's a lot more complex than that.
It's more what's their purpose, right? So I think
Yeah,
if
exactly. Because we're
if
back to
people are
that word again.
watching, yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, if you're watching and you're building a business, and so you probably thought about where do you want to get to. Maybe you've thought about the exit and what it needs to look like to get there. Maybe you haven't. Maybe just enjoying the moment of being an entrepreneur,
Hmm.
etc. Um, but sometimes, yeah, it can be good to think about that. What
Hmm.
is the purpose when you take
Absolutely
all the
huge.
labels away? What's the purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's having something else. You'll often see with football club owners. They'll sell the club, and then they don't know what to do with themselves. They then have to go and buy another club just because they miss it so much. There was the
Yeah,
guy died recently, Milan Mandaric. Whenever he sold a club, he had to go and buy another one just for the thrill. There's that
like a
saying:
sense of purpose.
how do you make a small fortune out of football? Start with a large one.
Yeah, I mean that's happened so often in so many different scenarios. I mean, it happens with parents, doesn't it? Kids fly the
Yeah,
nest, and who the hell am I?
yeah.
You know?
I can vouch for that. Being the father of two kids, it was quite strange
Yeah,
when they were both at university. I had to reintroduce myself to my wife. She'll kill
yeah.
me for saying that.
Date night.
Yeah.
So so what about then? Is buying any different? So if you're the buyer,
I think so because the buyer is more in control of the process. It can be, I mean, again, from a buyer's point of view, it can be particularly stressful if they're one of three or four main bidders. Um, but I think that the buyer's got that level of control, can control the timing, unless say the business they're looking to buy has a financial risk, so they've got to move quickly. But the buyer's point of view, from the buyer's point of view, it's the key I always say to a buyer is don't spend considerable sums of money on advisors until you've done some high level financial due diligence, just to establish, for example, the business you're looking at isn't actually worth 5 million, it's worth 3 million, for example. That happens frequently.
yeah, don't take it at face value.
No, no. Just because the business broker is saying offers in the region of £10 million doesn't mean it's worth 10 million. It's back to the estate agents again.
What would you say are the biggest red flags to look for?
Oh, undoubtedly issues with HMRC. For example, this is really common. A business has engaged consultants, but in reality, they're employees. Without going into details to explain how that's the case, it's more what the reality is as opposed to what the contract says. The contract can say they're consultants. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. If they are basically taking orders and being asked to turn up, say 9 to 5, that would suggest they're employees. That would suggest the business will have a PAYE hit and penalties. So that would be a very important part. That's often one of the main parts where business sales fall down because there's a huge tax risk. Now,
Mm,
in the agreement, you can put in things like a very wide tax indemnity. So if there's a claim, the seller has to pay up. But no one really wants to have to go through litigation to recover what they've spent.
So let's talk IP. So there's a stat from the World IP Organization. 30% of small businesses have faced some form of IP infringement that severely impacts the valuation during sale.
Yeah, I think it comes down to what the nature of the business is. If it's a business which relies heavily on its intellectual property, then that's a huge risk. Um, and you can get these days, I guess, you can get insurance for those risks. But yeah, I think it's the nature of the business. Most of the businesses I've been involved with on a sales side are what I would call people businesses: bars, restaurants, retail, all the ones which tend to get into difficulty from time to time and have some real characters running the business. I've got a business
Yeah,
partner. I've got a business partner. If there was a business we were selling which had a hefty intellectual property angle, I might defer to him because he'd have a better handle on intellectual property than I would. Same with, say, technology as well. He's very much into technology businesses and the AI thing. I tend to prefer the people ones.
interesting. And so I'm intrigued. We hadn't said that we would discuss this, but I'm intrigued. Obviously, you're going to see a lot of businesses. So, what are the what sort of setups are there? Is it more, is there one owner? Is there multiple like what's the common
Whole
setup that you would
host,
see?
whole host. The easier ones to sell are where it's just one shareholder. We've got one on at the moment where it's husband and wife own 90%. And they've got 3 minority shareholders who own 10%. Now, they're just going to get, as it happens, they support the sale. But if they didn't support the sale, then they'd be mad because 10% minority interest doesn't give them any level of control. And sometimes to get around that anyway, to bring them with the deal, you have something called drag along provisions in a shareholders agreement, which means that the minority can be dragged along because from a seller perspective, you get more if you sell 100% than if you sell 90%. But generally the ones which become more complex are where there are two categories of owners, and I'll explain that. So you've got the owner managed shareholders, they're in the business, they know exactly what goes on. And you've got, say, investor shareholders who have put money in for shares, but they have no say in the running of the business. So they would probably say, actually, I don't want to give warranties because I haven't been involved in the business. You're the ones running the business, you give the warranties. And we've just got to be a little bit careful there because typically we want to act for all the shareholders on a sale, but we've got to be careful there's not a conflict of interest which arises, which can happen because the interests of the investor may be different to the interests of the business owner, and we'd rather not. But sometimes we've had to bring in other lawyers to avoid the conflict, and that makes the process a bit more complicated.
Got you. Okay. What about any hidden risks that maybe the viewers might not think of as something to put into the equation? Like, are there any kind of things that people should think of way ahead?
If the buyer knows the industry, that's a huge advantage. If I'm acting for a buyer who doesn't know the industry, then I'm a little bit more skeptical. So I'm the one then encouraging them to look at how the industry plays out, who are the main players in the industry.
Yeah.
That's often forgotten because the buyer's got a pot of cash in their pocket and they just want to get on and spend it. Not sure I've really answered your question there, but I'm not.
But the ducks need to line up, so it's an important point to think about actually, whether you know the industry or not as a buyer.
Yeah, absolutely. If the buyer, if it's a new client introduced to me, and the buyer and it's acting for the buyer, if the buyer's already in the industry, I'm much more relaxed about the chances of it going through. I should explain as well. I mean, how one of the main questions a buyer will have is how much is it going to cost me?
Yeah.
So if we leave the business broker to one end because we haven't brought that person in, you've got the accountancy fees and legal and tax fees. The accountant, why is the accountant needed? Often to establish and get cash out of the business, there's a completion account mechanism. Completion accounts are prepared as at the date of completion. It'll typically take 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. They're agreed between the accountants and they're agreed between the clients. And that's extra cash, usually extra cash, that the seller receives. So rather than taking out, say, the £1 million cash before completion, they get it 3 or 4 weeks after completion. And that's, accountants are invaluable in that part. Also, there'll be financial and accounting warranties, all about whether the accounts have been kept properly and what management accounts are like. Again, we rely on the accountant. Our role then as lawyers is to look at all the legal warranties. So we would often give a firm estimate on fees at the outset when we get the initial contact, and then we firm that up and give a fixed fee. So we are then committed to what our fees would be for acting through the transaction, subject to sometimes a couple of caveats, like if the sale is delayed by a couple of months, or if the structure of the sale subsequently changes, then we reserve the right to have another conversation with the seller. But the seller can be assured they've got a level of certainty as to what the costs are going to be. Because I think sometimes in the seller's mind, they think it's going to cost them 10% of 10 million. There's nothing like that at all. Nothing like that.
How do you think, or how do you balance sometimes if there is a legal point to decide whether to argue? is there kind of like a trade-off to, if you argue this point, the sale takes 6 months longer, like, is there a balance between what to fight and what not to fight?
So let's say we're in a scenario now where the buyer's put forward an offer of, say, 5 million, and the buyer then says, we'll give you 3 million on completion, but the other 2 million is subject to how the business performs. And it may be over a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. Now, if the seller is sensible, the seller is going to want to have a level of control over that earnout. In other words, the seller is going to need to remain involved in the business, because the seller will be, I don't know, handing over the customer contracts, introducing the key people to the buyer. But a lot of sellers have trouble taking instructions from someone new. So if you've got a seller who's like that, who you know is going to struggle to knuckle down and do the earnout, your job then is to squeeze as much up front as you can and tell the seller, look, take 3.5 up front, and if you never see the 1.5 again because it's on the earnout, so be it. That's the money you'll get for it. If that's enough for the seller to live on for the rest of their life, that's great. But the earnouts can be very, the best earnouts, the best form of earnouts are drafted in such a way where it's a win-win scenario. So the seller wins and the buyer wins.
But this is surely, David, where again lawyers make their their weight in gold, because the balance that I can imagine, if you from on the selling side of things, and that balance and control, it's very easy to fall on the wrong side of that.
Absolutely. And you can have the most watertight of documents, but you have to sort of form a view as to how trustworthy the buyer is, because you've got all the legal contractual wording, but does a seller really want to go to court and litigate and spend a lot of time and money and then get involved in expensive mediation? Probably not. So it has to be a very well drafted earnout where it's the buyer benefits. Oddly as it sounds, the more the seller earns, the better the buyer does. They're the best ones.
Can I ask, how does the interaction go? So you've got the buyer's lawyer and the seller's lawyer. Is it ever kind of like, you have a conversation on the phone and you're just laughing, look, come on, John, you can't really, come on, let's get rid of that, put this in.
Sometimes that's the case. We have law firms where we shudder. We think, oh God, this is going to be a painful transaction, because they will literally fight over every single aspect. I won't mention any names. And there are other law firms, take a commercial approach. Sometimes, from a deal perspective, if it's got to be done quickly and there's not a lot of cash on the table, you've got to act pragmatically. You've got to involve the buyer or seller in the process, and you basically tell them they've got to act reasonably, because otherwise the fees will be out of proportion to the transaction. But yes, definitely, there are some law firms who can take a very, very aggressive stance to negotiations.
Interesting. And you know who they are. You hear the name and you know you're in for a battle.
Yeah.
Love that. Okay, so let's talk sports then, because I think there's probably a load of lessons from the sports world. I love the sports world, by the way, so I get really excited. So what sort of things do you do in the sports world?
Generally, my roles, I'm a director of 2 non-league football clubs. My roles are more of a governance aspect, making sure the boards are properly run, making sure people with the right expertise are there. So I tend to be relatively hands-off. For one of the clubs, I review a lot of their commercial contracts. They have a huge online presence. They earn more money in shirt sponsorships than a lot of the lower division football clubs. It's really amazing. They're a club which has been on a journey for 25 years and are still pushing their way up the leagues. The other one is an established ex-Football League club where they're trying to rebuild the fan base after being derelict for a few years. They're quite different. I mean, there is no such thing as sports law. That's the first thing I should say. It's basically law for people within the sports sector. So that could be reviewing contracts, drafting contracts, making sure you touched upon intellectual property before, making sure the insurance. Yeah, absolutely. Professional clubs will insure their players, but from a player perspective, it's worth the player considering whether they want to get some form of injury insurance. So if they had a catastrophic injury and it meant they couldn't play again, they would still have a lump sum of cash that could use to move into something else. So it may be, for example, acting for a sports person on a very discreet basis who wants to make a will, or about to get married, who wants to have a prenuptial agreement, or they may be buying a house and they don't want that say to be in the public domain. And we're very good at that work, handling it on a discreet basis.
Interesting. What would you say are probably the maybe 2 or 3 lessons that we might learn from in business from sports or sports law? Are there any?
Oh, never been asked that question before.
Or how about another one then? What are the parallels between running a club and a business potentially? What are the similarities?
Well, there should be. There should be. And the best clubs are run as a business.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of clubs out there where the owner's ego gets in the way and they overspend. And you've got these regulations these days which penalizes football clubs if they overspend. And it's not universally popular, but that's it. You see it's the other way around in a way. You've got people who've had a really good business life, who've been really sensible, but when sport gets involved, they let emotions take over their mind, and they will make decisions and spend money that there's no way they would have done had it been their own business. So I think it's more that way around. We're seeing a lot more American owners in sport, and they tend to be probably more switched on, and they probably have a better idea on how to run things. I mean, in my past,
interesting.
I did a lot of work for an organisation called Supporters Direct, which helped groups of supporters get equity ownership of their clubs. In other words, there's always going to be a new owner, but to make sure that there was always some protection for the fans. But even that doesn't always work. You see Sheffield Wednesday at the moment just picking a club. They're about to be served with a winding up petition, so they're probably going to get a 6 to 12 point penalty, which might then mean relegation for them this year. And it's the fans then who lose.
Yeah, so I suppose swings and roundabouts. What about, are there certain sectors that you like to work within, or you specialize within?
Yeah, very much the people businesses. Probably because I actually like meeting people, meeting clients, potential clients, other professional intermediaries. Whereas I guess now we've got the growth of AI, there are those lawyers who much prefer to be technicians. I like to be out and about, as I say, meeting business people, talking business, helping put people together, helping, if I've got a couple of contacts I think would suit each other if they were introduced, and that's what I would do.
So I shouldn't ask you, how does AI affect everything?
I'm an optimist when it comes to technology. I think AI will take away a lot of the drudgery work. It'll help out maybe in due diligence. It won't be a substitute. It'll help out maybe. We're trialing it now. We've taken out a few licenses for Thomson Reuters. It'll help prepare maybe first drafts of the agreement. What it won't stop is the requirement on lawyers to check what AI has produced, particularly
could be
in
risky.
court applications. Well, we've heard stories whereby lawyers have relied on AI when putting together a claim, and the claim refers to, say, 2 or 3 legal cases which AI have come up with. They don't actually ever exist. That's one example. But
Interesting.
I think there are a lot of people worried about AI, but I see it this way. You're too young to probably remember 30 years ago, but let's go back to the early mid-90s when the internet was coming out. Who had ever met a software engineer? Who had ever met a website designer? Those roles didn't exist. They've come about as a result of technology. We're still working as many hours as before. We might be working remotely, but we're still putting in the same hours. So I think things will evolve generally for the better. I think technology over time has always improved rather than diminished life. I know there is a lot of concern. I don't want to be glib about it. There's a lot of concern about, say, graduate jobs, and they're down at the moment. But they could be down partly because of the economy, because businesses are nervous about recruiting. I think it's too early to say. I don't think you can jump to assumptions.
I think as well, though, like it's not the first time we've had change, and you could argue that the access to education, because of AI, but also in general, is huge anyway. So if people, if the kind of the younger, for people like yourself, for myself and some others, where it's what's in your head. So it's not going to be that AI becomes the intelligence. It's going to be that AI, is an assistant to what you already, do, or the research assistant, or however we frame it. But people could upskill. I just want to move on to another. I remember a meeting that I sat in only last week, and it was quite a funny situation because it was actually someone had just gone through a buyout. And it was quite a big firm. So we're in the car sector. So imagine my prospective client was a car. Well, they have they sell cars. So they're a motor dealer, if you like. And so they want to be really ambitious. They want to do the generative engine optimization. They want to, so that whenever cars are mentioned, that it goes into a finance conversation in ChatGPT or Claude, DeepSeek, or wherever it is that someone's asking, okay, I want to buy a Porsche. Who does the finance for the Porsche? And then they want to be the answer to that question, so that then they can sell the car afterwards. So we're trying to re-engineer this. How do they become the answer to a question in there? So I'm sat in a meeting, and he said, "Oh, I brought in another chap who, they're responsible for kind of 10 or 11 different car businesses and a kind of fairly national or international company." And so I'm sat in front of them, and I'm talking to them about how they do their generative engine optimization. And one said to the other, so that my prospective client said to the other one, so I thought it would be good for your businesses too. So what do you think? Should we both do it? And he said, well, I can't make that decision. I don't own the business anymore. I have to run it by the powers that be. And the other one started laughing. He said, I forgot. He said, you used to just go yes or no. You used to just, yeah, we'll do it. No, we won't. And he said, no, this will take a couple of weeks. I'll have to take this back. So it was funny that the two of them, they'd been so used to just going, do you want to do it? Do you want to do it? Yes, no. And now he's got to ask someone else within his own business. So I guess he's got one of those where he's in there. And he's got to stay in there and produce the results.
Sounds that way, yeah. Just what I remember, there's a new, well, relatively new. I think it was introduced by the Conservative government in the mid-noughties, around about 2015. These days, business owners, they can sell to their employees, and I don't mean in the form of a management buyout. There's something called employee ownership trusts. These work well where the target company, i.e. the business being sold, is profitable. And then there's an employee benefit trust set up, which then over a period of time, can be a couple of years, can be several years, buys the business from the seller. So the employees then take control of the business. And this is something which has really grown in latter years because, I won't go into detail now, but there are certain tax benefits for the seller, which is attractive.
Okay.
So it's something, if there is anyone listening to this podcast considering selling, it's another route to sale, particularly if they can't find a trade buyer. What I would say is another older way of exiting, which is where you sold the business by way of a listing. That's not popular at all these days. Fewer and fewer businesses are listed. There's an exodus, and also from a seller point of view, you can list the business, but it's really difficult to sell down your shares because every time you sell your shares, the share price drops.
I want to think as well. I do a lot of I spend a lot of my time watching like podcasts, watching YouTube, and following certain in particular people more than I do listening to music or watching TV, or even reading books now. I find myself online kind of educating. There's someone I follow called Cody Sanchez, and and she talks a lot about how, you know, buying of businesses, and predominantly the pandemic, or not, it's not pandemic, an epidemic. I don't know if it's an epidemic. I don't know if that's the right word, but of kind of business owners who are reaching that age where they're probably going to want to retire now, but because of
Yeah,
how the younger generations have flipped, like maybe there's no one to buy the business, and so
very common, very, very common,
yeah.
particularly in professional service firms. And by that, I mean typically lawyers, accountants, surveyors. Um, the previous generation, and I'd include me in this, when you're coming through the ranks, you want to get promoted all the time. You want the next title. And eventually you aspire to being an equity partner because you want to be the business owner. And what you're seeing typically these days is the younger generations, it's probably more work-life balance. They're quite happy to progress within the business, but they get to a certain level and they don't actually want to take the ownership step because they're worried about the liabilities, more worried about the liabilities than they are encouraged by the profits. And so we see a lot of professional service firms where the owners, i.e. the partners, are well into their 60s and they don't know what to generally don't know what to do. They're desperate to find a merger partner to basically have an exit, and that's increasingly common.
Something for people
Particularly,
to think about, because
yeah, particularly with things like professional indemnity insurance becomes ever
yeah.
more expensive as a percentage of, say, turnover. Some of
Is
these.
there a solution to that? Because, you know, the Cody Sanchez goes with the approach of, you know, then you kind of you do like buyer financing or stuff. I don't know anything about it.
Oh,
But is there
you
an
can borrow
easy
the
way
money.
out?
I wouldn't say it's easy. You can borrow the money to pay for the insurance. You can borrow the money to pay for practice certificates. But all you're doing then is you're becoming ever more indebted, and
Yeah,
that can be a slippery slope to be on. But it's an area which has really affected accountants and solicitors, and probably explains why there's been some consolidation in both sectors.
interesting. Just briefly on the wider firm, what else is it that you do?
Me personally, in my spare time.
Well, no, I suppose in general, I mean, I imagine you do more as a firm,
Oh,
more
I
than
see. Sorry.
just this.
Let me just, I can explain for listeners. My firm, where I'm an equity partner, is Bishop and Sewell.
Yeah.
We are a central London-based firm. Where our office, we're a single office firm. That's quite important to make that distinction because there's always an element of risk when you open a second office. That means more management. So we're a single office firm on Russell Square. Set up 42 years ago by Stephen Bishop and Jill Sewell. Jill, I think, retired about 20 years ago. Stephen is still going, absolutely loves work, still doing his residential conveyancing. He's now a consultant with us, but seems to be more involved than ever he was. So we've got a very successful residential conveyancing team. Tend to focus on the high-end properties. We've got relationships with all the decent estate agents. Then we've got a commercial property department, and by that I mean we help clients who are buying business premises or want to lease out business premises. We have a landlord and tenant department. We do employment, business immigration, personal immigration. We've got a very large and very successful private client wealth management division. That's an area where there's been real growth. We deal with dispute resolution, otherwise known as litigation. And then there's my team, the corporate department, where we basically like to advise on deals, whether it's buying or selling.
And is there any kind of limits locations wise? Is that, you know, where can they be
I
anywhere?
think we frequently have opportunities to acquire other law firms, and we do take that seriously, and we look in depth. If the firm is based, say, a mile or two from our office, then it's a lot easier to have that level of control. There would be a lot more, say, risk if we were to buy a business located in a different part of the country. Because I think, and the other risk would be as and when we outgrow our current premises and we need the second office when we haven't got, say, overspill accommodation next door. That would introduce level of risk because I think typically the law firms and accountancy firms which get themselves into a position where they're stretched or where they end up with several offices dotted around becomes it's not necessarily efficient from a management point of view.
Sure. And I suppose by way of a kind of recap, so if you could give the top three rules of thumb or things to think about when selling, what would they be?
Right. One, make sure you've set enough time aside because it is a time-consuming process. Secondly, do ask around for recommendations on good advisors. Do ask your accountant who they recommend on the legal side. Don't just sign a contract with a business broker without fully understanding what it says and without maybe speaking to a lawyer or accountant first. And if you're acting for the seller, make sure the buyer's got the cash or got access to the cash.
Sure. Okay. Is there anything you think I should have asked you that I haven't asked you?
Gosh, I don't know. We've been talking for a while. We've covered a wide variety of topics. I think we've covered more or less everything across the piece. I promise you that if something comes to mind, which I think is very important for the audience, we'll do this again.
Yeah, sounds good. And so also for the audience, is there any if I mean you probably might have answered it in a number of different capacities of what the firm does, etc. But you know, in a perfect world, who would you be looking to work with? What's the thing that excites you most? Or you know, what if someone's watching?
Me as a lawyer,
Yeah, you.
I like to work with clients who keep us in the loop, who ask for our opinion and value that opinion, who are approachable, who basically do what they say they're going to do. So if you've got one who says, I want to be involved in every stage of the process, that's great. Some will say, just drop me an email every day, once a day, just tell me where we've got to in the process.
Mm.
Yeah, basically having a client that you can trust who respects the advice they receive.
So if that's you, if that sounds like you, then you can reach out to David. And obviously, what we'll do is we'll put a link in the comments to your LinkedIn so that they can
Yeah, I would be
come to
delighted
you.
to stress that I, again, want to be transparent here on fees. I'm very happy to give no obligations advice, i.e., we don't charge for picking up the phone or for sending an email. So I just want to reassure listeners out there if they are thinking of it, then I'm very approachable and very happy to help wherever I can.
Wonderful. Well, look, it's been a pleasure having you on. And for those of you watching, we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Dean. Thanks to everyone for listening.
Thanks, David.